Whenever anything bad happens in Texas, you know what? Scratch that. Whenever Texas does anything bad, people just kind of dismiss it as, Texas, acting up. It's Texas. Texas kind of has a similar reputation to Florida in that regard. But in the same way that I hope people have finally started putting a face to Florida's shit, Ron DeSantis' face to be specific, my hope for this video is that by the time I'm done, when you hear the calamity happening in Texas, you'll have a better understanding of what's happening in Texas and why, and that the face that pops up in your head when you think of Texas is their all too powerful Governor Greg Abbott. So listen, I have been meaning to give Republican Texas Governor Greg Abbott the Eric Adams treatment for a while, because it's what he deserves. The man is a demon, which, don't get me wrong, most any standard issue Republican is. But Greg Abbott is much, much worse than that because one, he's a demon who gets a lot of evil shit done, and he's been getting it done a long time. He is a relic from the George Bush era, first George Bush. He is the second longest serving governor in Texas history. And two, he's exceptionally dangerous because he's not just Texas's problem, he's all of ours. Actually, if I'm honest, Texas in and of itself is all of our problem. The first thing that you should know about Greg Abbott is that he's not new to this, he's true to this. Before he was the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott held just about every influential position of power in Texas you can think of. He was a state trial judge in Texas before then governor and former President George Bush appointed him to the Texas Supreme Court, where he served from 1996 to 2001. When he left the Texas Supreme Court, he then became Texas's Attorney General, which is where he spent most of the time laying the groundwork for everything he's doing now as governor. And he did that from 2002 to 2015. He was actually the Attorney General for longer than anyone else in Texas history. And then, immediately after serving as Attorney General, the motherfucker ran for governor and he won. And he assumed office in 2015, where he's been ever since, because this motherfucker is on his third term. Despite a litany of reasons I'm going to present to you in this video, Texas has reelected him not once, but twice, with the most recent person to have their ass unfortunately handed to them being Beto O'Rourke. And can we just talk about that right quick? Because people who don't live in the South have a tendency to just write the Southern states off as red states, where the people get what they voted for. And that's actually a really reductive look at the situation that fails to take into consideration that the Southern states have been deep in their voter suppression, abuse of power, gerrymandering bag for longer than you've been alive. Gerrymandering refers to how political parties get to game the system by redrawing the legislative and congressional districts to favor them. Texas has been redrawing and carving up communities to destroy the Black and Latino vote from time. Specifically, the Texas chapter of the ACLU presents some of the primary tactics that they use to suppress the vote in Texas. One, being not offering online voter registration. Two, in Texas, they have some of the strictest voter ID laws in the country. And it's not despite of this, it's because people of color are more likely not to have the right ID. And three, they have some of the longest lines to vote in the country, especially in BIPOC neighborhoods, and that's intentionally kept that way to disincentivize those voters, which is evidenced by the fact that they passed a law to prohibit 24-hour voting, which would have combated the problem. 4, they restrict assistance for voters with disabilities and those speaking limited English. 5, they severely limit who can vote by mail. To vote by mail in Texas, you have to be 65 or older, have a disability or illness, be incarcerated. Mind you, Texas doesn't allow anyone incarcerated on a felony or on probation or on parole to vote. If you'll be outside the country or you're expected to give birth within 3 weeks of election day, and of those limited people who can vote by mail, they throw out votes for any of the tiniest errors. And 6, they weaponize the criminal system against people for any tiny error or misunderstanding of election law. And they do this disproportionately to women of color. And speaking of weaponizing criminal penalties, I would not be me if I didn't tell you how the criminal system is used to suppress marginalized people in a myriad of ways, including but not limited to the right to vote. How? Felon disenfranchisement. Felon disenfranchisement is the criminal's 2-for-1. Kill 2 birds with 1 stone. The state doesn't just get to put its foot to the necks of Black, brown, and poor folk as it doles out criminal convictions, incarceration, and the trauma and poverty it ensures. The system also gets to take your right to vote to ensure you never get the opportunity to remove that foot from your neck. And that's why Texas loves it. According to the Sentencing Project, Texas has taken away more people's right to vote than 47 states combined. Texas deprives 455,160 citizens from the right to vote. Now back to Greg Abbott. He's in his third term as governor, and he says he hasn't ruled out running a fourth time. And I'm not confused as to why Republicans keep electing him. If you want to see hell on earth, which Republicans certainly do, this would be the root for right here, because he's getting it done. In fact, Greg Abbott has more power than any Texas governor has ever had because he saw to it. In 2018, he expanded his powers as governor without any legal authority to do so. He informed all Texas state agencies that they would be required to submit any proposed new rules to him before they could make them available to the public for comment. And as far as the Texas legislature itself, which has a Republican majority in both the House and the Senate, even if they wanted to do something even remotely progressive or in the best interest of Texans, good luck doing so, because Greg Abbott is going to veto that shit faster than you can get it drafted. And there's nothing they can do about it, because Texas law would require that Greg Abbott himself call the special session to allow the legislature to override him. And he's obviously not gonna do that shit, which is precisely why a Texas legislature hasn't overridden a governor's veto since 1979. And that's why there's nobody in the game using their veto power like Greg Abbott uses his veto power. In 2023, he vetoed 76 bills, which is the second highest amount a Texas governor has ever vetoed in a single session in the state's history. Collectively, Greg Abbott has vetoed 251 bills since his first term as governor. What I am trying to get across to you is that every regressive thing you've heard about Texas in, say, the last 30 years, this motherfucker has had a hand in one shape or another. He has been shaping Texas in his image for quite some time. So what particular negative association his name has in your mind depends on how you're familiar with him. If you know him from the Obama era, which there's a high probability you do, because as Attorney General, he sued the Obama administration 31 times, more than any other state. So if you remember him from then, you probably associate him with trying to destroy the Affordable Care Act. If you really go way back with him, you probably associate him with fighting against gay marriage. And if he first appeared on your radar in this era's national news, you probably know him from busing migrants to Washington, D.C., New York City, Chicago, Philadelphia, Denver, and Los Angeles, and any other sanctuary city as a big you to who he perceives as the liberal Democrats who are soft on immigration. I say perceive because, contrary to popular belief, just because a city has Black people in it and Democrat leaders does not mean they're a friend to immigrants or marginalized people of any variety. Take Eric Adams' war on the migrants, for example, and how he and NYPD have been spreading all the propaganda in the world to turn people against the migrants, like releasing edited footage to make it appear that migrants attacked police officers out of thin air so that people would be outraged, see the migrants as criminals, and thus be more likely to support mistreating them. Adams called to end the right to shelter and has caused regressive calls for deportation. Meanwhile, from the police officers' own body-worn camera footage showed that the officers attacked them first. But we're getting off topic. Back to how you might know Greg Abbott. You might know him for his wickedness at the border, his multiple abortion bans, or all the he has yet to give about any of the 7 mass shootings that Texas has had on his watch. But the reasons why you should hate him and why Texas needs to stop re-electing him go so much further beyond that. Because of not just what he's doing and has been doing to Texas and the migrants entering the US through Texas, but because of my second point, that he's no longer just a shining example to point to for why you wouldn't want to move to a Republican-led state. It's because he's now quite literally driving us towards civil war and tearing apart the delicate fabric keeping this nation together. So today, we're going to discuss why Greg Abbott is one of the worst things, not just to happen to Texas, but to the United States of America. The reason Greg Abbott is everyone's problem is because his actions are quite literally threatening to implode this union. Yes, I'm talking union. And 2, that he's exceptionally dangerous, and I am not being hyperbolic. I'm sure a lot of you probably clicked on this video because you've seen on the news the fight Greg Abbott and the federal government are having over the border right now. The simplified explanation is this. The Constitution separates state governments from the federal government. Certain powers are left to the states, while others are left to the federal government. When there is conflict between the state and the federal government, or power overlaps between purviews, the Constitution dictates that the federal government win out. The border between Mexico and the United States is in Texas, and so Texas does have some legitimate state interest in what happens at the border, but still, immigration and the border fall squarely under the federal government's authority, which the Supreme Court has confirmed. But hear me and hear me good. Greg Abbott couldn't give a less about none of that shit. Remember, I told you earlier that he is keen on expanding his own power despite having no legal authority to do so. Look no further for a better example than everything he does on immigration. In December 2023, Greg Abbott actually signed a bill making illegal immigration a state crime, which is some outright unconstitutional shit. Beyond just the terror and what him doing that should have immediately signaled to us that these think they're autonomous, all-powerful beings, the federal government, and a check and a balance. Because states are not allowed to make immigration law, the law would let state police arrest people on suspicion for having crossed the border. Really think about that shit. State police officers with the freedom to decide any Latino person they see illegally cross the border and arrest them. And the judges can decide if they want to drop the charges if the accused migrant agrees to return to Mexico. And again, states do not have the legal authority to deport people or to demand that a country, in this case Mexico, accept people it hasn't agreed to take. I want to remind y'all, not everybody crossing the border is Mexican or from Mexico. But Texas is telling you that they want to just be grabbing Latinos off the street and sending them to Mexico. And here's the gag. That's exactly what's happening, and the results are so much worse than you think.
So under Operation Lone Star, we've hijacked the criminal justice system to address a so-called immigration problem. And actually, I was looking at the latest data. Believe it or not, over 70% of the people who are being arrested under Operation Lone Star are American citizens. So 2021, we were not going to do bailouts, but this was so horrendous that we could not do something about it. There was an American citizen trans woman who was being held with men because at that time there were only 2 facilities. And they were only arresting men. And so she was being held with men, and it was just horrific, the sexual assaults on her. And so we connected with the LGBTQ Freedom Fund from Florida. They gave us some money, and together we kind of bailed her out and sent her back to her home in Seattle. And sure enough, the case dismissed, charges all dropped. Now we're just waiting for the money to come back.
Let's make sure we understand what's happened there and what's happening. They used Operation Lone Star and Greg Abbott's Arrest Anyone You Think Crossed the Border to arrest and jail an American citizen, and though the charges would be inevitably dropped, that wasn't before they placed a trans woman in men's prison to be raped and sexually abused. And that's just one story, but over 70% of the people that they're arresting under suspicion of being undocumented immigrants are American citizens who are being jailed and tortured. And you want to know what's extra wild about all this? Greg Abbott is a perfect example of why "I'm not racist, I have a black friend" isn't an effective argument. Because what if I told you that this Greg Abbott's wife is a whole ass Mexican? Like her grandparents were Mexican immigrants. Dog. And she's a real my man ass gal, okay? She gonna stick beside him. And the only thing crazier than Abbott having a Latino wife who seems blissfully unconcerned with him kicking her people's back in, so too does he have a sizable amount of the Latino vote. Why that is, beyond the very real issue of gerrymandering their communities to dilute their vote, I couldn't legitimately say. I don't really generally get into the Latino community's business like that. I just try to mind my own black ass business. But maybe y'all should call a meeting amongst yourselves or something, guys. Just a suggestion. But in 2022, to be fair, he did lose a little bit of the Latino vote, going from 42% to 40%. And listen, it's not just the Mexicans and anyone he thinks looks like him, including his wife, for Greg Abbott. It's people who look like him too. Because you would think a disabled man who uses a wheelchair himself would have more compassion for other people with disabilities, but that could not be further from the truth. Greg Abbott was paralyzed when he was 26 years old after an oak tree fell on him while he was jogging. He sued the homeowner whose tree had fallen on him and a tree service company, and he got a $400,000 tax-free settlement and monthly payments for life. And he's been very open about the fact that he's relied on those medical expenses for about 30 years. And yet, would you believe that in 2003, when he was Attorney General, this was the who was a big proponent of Texas capping the amount of money people could be awarded in medical malpractice suits at $250,000. Ain't that about a bitch? But back to the topic at hand. Allowing police to be able to arrest anybody on suspicion of being an undocumented immigrant who crossed the border is more than just a little akin to requiring freed slaves to walk around with freedom papers. And it's something Republicans have been trying to make happen. They've been trying to make this happen. In 2012, the Supreme Court struck down a law that the Arizona Republicans had passed, making it a crime for immigrants not to carry their immigration papers at all times and giving police the freedom to investigate anyone they wanted to's immigration status. So, not only is it some overtly racist Jim Crow ass shit, you know what? Some overtly racist, fascist Jim Crow ass shit that's very plainly unconstitutional on its face because, again, immigration is a federal issue. The Supreme Court has already ruled on the issue, but you're going to find that Texas, Republicans, and the Confederate States, more specifically, are big on trying the same arguments and strategies to expand their power and endanger folk all throughout Americans' history. It's the same playbook, and that's a good thing. That's actually very valuable for us because it allows us not to be caught by surprise. Now listen up. So Greg Abbott is notorious for being intensely anti-immigration, and he's been that way. But his efforts to endanger migrants at the border have amplified since 2021 with the launch of what he calls Operation Lone Star. It's a multi-billion-dollar border security program, which simply means this. Since 2021, Abbott has spent billions of dollars installing illegal and dangerous razor wires and barriers in the water that endanger both migrants and the federal agents that have to guard the border. Abbott insists that these razor wires and barriers are necessary to deter people from crossing the border. But statistics reveal that has not been the case, as one, people continue to cross the border because what people like Greg Abbott deliberately choose to ignore is that people who are risking their lives and the lives of their children to migrate are not doing so because they think it's fun, because it's easy, or because they can't be bothered to do it the right way. Do it the right way. It's because they literally have no choice for one reason or the next. And for many Latin American countries, their migration has been made necessary by the US's involvement in their countries. Moreover, despite the hysteria made about undocumented immigrants and immigrants crossing the border, most immigrants entering America are not coming through the border, and most enter lawfully. But further, most currently undocumented immigrants did not enter the country as undocumented immigrants. They came in lawfully, and they're simply visa overstays. America's deliberately stringent immigration system simply doesn't provide people the option to remain or work lawfully. And side tangent, which Donald Trump's wife Melania knows a lot about, and no one ever brings up despite the fact that Trump and the Republicans make it their business to talk about doing it the right way. Melania Trump has told so many obvious lies, and inconsistencies about our immigration situation that any immigration lawyer or immigrant who has ever had a visa could see. Homegirl entered America on a short-term travel visa that does not allow you to work or make money, but she proceeded to model all over the place, very obviously in violation of that tourist visa, until she could eventually nestle up to a withering authoritarian nectarine hell-bent on making the immigration system she knows is hard even harder, while vilifying immigrants who do half of what she did, just with 20 times the scrutiny. Sorry for the side tangent, but I'm always thinking about this. But if you're interested, here is a good article from Politico that you can read. Contrary to popular belief, an immigrant cannot just decide that they want to be a citizen or get a work visa and get one. You can't just sit a test, no matter how many times you see that on American television. 85% of all undocumented immigrants in America are visa overstays. I don't want to stray too much off topic, although I thought y'all needed a little bit of context, so I encourage you to read a book called Border and Rule. But the conflict happening now that you're seeing in the news is because Greg Abbott hates migrants and wants to prevent them from crossing the border so much that he quite literally will kill them to do so. He ordered that the Texas National Guard set up razor wire and floating razor barriers in the water so that the migrants swimming in the water could not cross the border without being mangled or killed. And they also can't turn back because of the current or they'll drown. And that's exactly what's been happening. And that's what finally made the Biden administration take some semblance of action when in January, a woman and her 2 children drowned in the Rio Grande. Because not only did Texas officials refuse to help, they refused to allow the federal officials access beyond the barrier so that they could help the woman and her 10-year-old and 8-year-old child. So they all drowned. Last year, the Houston Chronicle reported that the public safety trooper said that he and other officers were told to, quote, push small children and nursing babies back into the Rio Grande, and have been told not to give the water to asylum seekers even in extreme heat. Mind you, people have a legal right to seek asylum, you know.
We are deploying every tool and strategy that we possibly can. The only thing that we're not doing is we're not shooting people who come across the border because, of course, the Biden administration would charge us with murder.
And that's not even the extent of it. The extent of the inhumanity Greg Abbott is commanding migrants be on the receiving end of. According to AP News, Texas trooper Nicholas Wingate wrote an email to his supervisors lamenting about the inhumanity of what he and the other border agents were being required to do. He actually went as far as to say that the, quote, inhumane things they're doing were not right in the eyes of God. In his email, he said that on June 25, 2023, when he ran into a group of 120 migrants, many of whom were little kids and nursing mothers, he and the other agent were ordered to push the people back into the water to go to Mexico. That's a quote. In his email, he said that he also witnessed a 4-year-old girl trying to cross the border through the razor wire, and that the Texas National Guard pushed the little girl back as they're required to do, and she eventually passed out from the heat, as well as he witnessed a 19-year-old woman having a miscarriage because she'd been cut so badly by the wire. The email chain documented 38 different incidents between June 25th and July 1st of 2023, where migrants were desperately in need of medical assistance because of the injuries that they had sustained from Texas's barriers, including weakness to lacerations, broken limbs, and drownings. And of those 38 migrants, those 38 different incidents, 12 were babies and not even a year old yet. Are you hearing the kind of wickedness that they're intentionally bringing about? Dog. And here's where it gets scary. Yes, where it starts getting scary. So the federal government demanded that they remove these illegal and dangerous barriers from the water, and these motherfuckers said no. So the Biden administration sent a cease and desist letter to the Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, and they didn't give a So in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court of the United States of America ruled for the federal government and said that they can remove the razor barrier and wires because they are preventing the federal government from having access and control of the border. Now here's where shit starts getting really crazy. Texas said, the Supreme Court, the federal government, and the President of the United States, they're not removing shit. And if the federal government takes it down, they'll put it right back the up. In fact, they said they're gonna put up more wire. Speaking on behalf of Governor Abbott, the Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, said, quote, "We are putting up wire everywhere we can. We will continue. We will not stop. If they cut it, we will replace it." You have to understand, they're not just putting up razor wire and ignoring whatever the federal government says as it pertains to the border. Texas is also using $1.5 billion of their own money to create their own border near the border between Mexico and Texas. What I think is particularly noteworthy about the fact that Abbott is saying fuck the Supreme Court is that this is the most far-right nut-job-ass Supreme Court ever. The Mickey Mouse operation we call a Supreme Court right now is stacked with right-wing goons who have explicitly made their intentions of rolling back all of our rights and civil liberties known. And those right-wing ghouls have been on a roll, steamrolling over our rights with ease because they're the majority of the court. From the pre-Trump era, we've got Chief John Roberts, Clarence Thomas, Samuel whack-ass Alito, and post-Trump, we've got Neil Gorsuch, Brett, you know what he is, Kavanaugh, and unqualified-ass Amy Coney Barrett. That's 6 of 9 lifetime appointments the right has on the court. And as a result, we're down abortion, affirmative action, and according to the words of justices like Clarence Thomas, they believe that they have a duty, a quote, duty to correct the error that they made by giving us every right that stems from a case called Griswold versus Connecticut's right to privacy, except the right to interracial marriage. If you're wondering why not interracial marriage, okay then. More specifically, the rights to contraceptives, the right to same-sex marriage, and the right to same-sexual relationships. My point is that even that nut-ass right-wing court that actively wants to take all of our rights away and has no problem rubber stamping every case the right has deliberately brought to its doorstep. Which, might I add, the right would be calling judicial activism if the left did it. which is what they spent years calling cases like Brown versus Board of Education and Roe, ironically enough, and anything that happened during the New Deal era. But back to the point. Even this right-wing court disagreed with Texas. Understand that. Greg Abbott's Texas is going too far for even this Supreme Court. And here's the real gag. Greg Abbott wants to go much, much further. The first thing Greg Abbott said in a statement he issued addressing his refusal to remove the borders was that, quote, the federal government has broken the compact between the United States and the states. Greg Abbott is going straight Southern Confederacy. Let's secede from the United States and Civil War this bitch out. I mean, he explicitly embraced the Confederate theory of secession, which is called the Compact Theory. If you've never heard of the Compact Theory, it was the basis of the secession acts of the 13 Confederate states when South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky, and Texas seceded in 1860 because they couldn't stand for a world without their slaves. In the secession acts, which obviously preceded the Civil War, the 13 Confederate states declared that they were dissolving the Union that was united under the Compact, that is, the Constitution. The argument was and is essentially that America was formed through the consent of the states through a compact agreed upon, the Constitution. The argument is that each state is in and of itself its own independent sovereign nation that agreed to a compact under the Constitution and can thus void that contract and thus the federal law and their constitutional obligations. That's how, in the minds of the Confederacy, they were independent nations who were free to void the Constitution and enter into a separate compact, the Confederacy, just so they could keep their slaves. Pay close attention listening to the language in this quote that I'm about to read, y'all. Yes, it's a little long and in Old English, but it is necessary. Listen to the shit that they are saying because we are going to compare in a moment. On February 2nd, 1861, Texas declared via their Declaration of Causes, which impelled the state of Texas to secede from the federal union. Quote, Texas abandoned her separate national existence and consented to become one of the Confederate states to promote her welfare, ensure domestic tranquility, and secure more substantially the blessings of peace and liberty to her people. She was received into the Confederacy with her own constitution, under the guarantee of the federal constitution and the compact of annexation that she should enjoy these blessings. She was received as a commonwealth holding, maintaining, and protecting the institution known as Negro slavery, the servitude of the African to the white race within her limits, a relation that existed from the first settlement of her wilderness by the white race, and which her people intended should exist in all future time. Her institutions and geographical position established the strongest ties between her and other slave-holding states of the Confederacy. Those ties have been strengthened by association. But what has been the course of the government of the United States and of the people and authorities of the non-slave-holding states since our connection with them? The controlling majority of the federal government, under various pretenses and disguises, has so administered the same as to exclude the citizens of the southern states unless under odious and unconstitutional restrictions from all the immense territory owned in common by all the states on the Pacific Ocean for the avowed purpose of requiring sufficient power in the common government to use it as a means of destroying the institutions of Texas and her sister slave-holding states by the disloyalty of the northern states and their citizens and the imbecility of the federal government. Infamous combinations of incendiaries and outlaws have been permitted in those states and the common territory of Kansas to trample upon the federal laws, to war upon the lives and property of southern citizens in that territory, and finally, by violence and mob law, to usurp the possession of the same as exclusively the property of the northern states. The federal government, while but partially under the control of these, our unnatural and sectional enemies, has for years almost entirely failed to protect the lives and property of the people of Texas against the Indian savages on our border, and more recently against the murderous forays of banditti from the neighboring territory of Mexico. And when our state government has expended large amounts for such purpose, the federal government has refused reimbursement, therefore, thus rendering our condition more insecure and harassing than it was during the existence of the Republic of Texas. In other words, Texas is our own place. We only agreed to be here if it would benefit us, and it needed to benefit us with our slaves that we said we was gonna have forever, and with all the money given to us to keep these goddamn Native Americans and Latinos off our land, goddammit. And if that's not happening, the federal government is in breach of what the we agreed to, because we agreed to slaves forever, and keeping these slaves, these Latinos, and these Native Americans in their place. And because the federal government ain't doing it, Texas is overrun with the stress of these goddamn migrants stealing from us and being criminals and costing us money. So we are going to go secede and kick it with the other southern states because we want our slaves, damn it, and keep them Mexicans off our land. That's what the they said. That's what they said. Now, I need you to compare that language from Confederate Texas in 1861 to the statement released by Greg Abbott on January 24th, 2024. Quote from Greg Abbott: "The federal government has broken the compact between the United States and the states. The executive branch of the United States has a constitutional duty to enforce federal laws protecting states, including immigration laws on the books right now. President Biden has refused to enforce those laws and has even violated them. The result is that he has smashed records for illegal immigration. Despite having been put on notice in a series of letters, one of which I delivered to him by hand, President Biden has ignored Texas's demand that he perform his constitutional duties. President Biden has violated his oath to faithfully execute immigration laws enacted by Congress. Instead of prosecuting immigrants for federal crime of illegal entry, President Biden has sent his lawyers into federal court to sue Texas for taking action to secure the border. President Biden has instructed his agencies to ignore federal statutes that mandate the detention of illegal immigrants. The effect is to illegally allow their en masse parole into the United States. By wasting taxpayer dollars to tear open Texas's border security infrastructure, President Biden has enticed illegal immigrants away from the 28 legal entry points along the state's southern border, bridges where nobody drowns, into the dangerous waters of the Rio Grande. Under President Biden's lawless border policies, more than 6 million illegal immigrants have crossed our southern border in just 3 years. That is more than the population of 33 different states in this country. This illegal refusal to protect the states has inflicted unprecedented harm on the people all across the United States. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and the other visionaries who wrote the U.S. Constitution foresaw that states should not be left to the mercy of a lawless president who does nothing to stop external threats like cartels smuggling millions of illegal immigrants across the border. That is why the framers included both Article 4, Section 4, which promises that the federal government shall, quote, protect each state against invasion, and Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, which acknowledges the state's sovereign interest in protecting their borders. Mind you, he's quoting a dissent. He's quoting Scalia's dissent in Arizona versus the United States. The failure of the Biden administration to fulfill the duties imposed by Article 4, Section 4 has triggered Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, which reserves to this state the right of self-defense. For these reasons, I have already declared an invasion under Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 to invoke Texas's constitutional authority to defend and protect itself. That authority is the supreme law of the land and supersedes any federal statutes to the contrary. The Texas National Guard, the Texas Department of Public Safety, and other Texas personnel are acting on that authority as well as state law to secure the Texas border. Both of those letters and declarations should make a few things clear, not least of which being that Texan hysteria about migrants, we the blacks and Native Americans, but mostly the commitment to criminalize Mexicans in specific, and using that as a justification for taking power and enacting violence and war is deeply, deeply, deeply Texas, Confederate, racist shit. One is in Old English and the other is new, but they went from calling Mexicans banditi in 1861 to drug smuggling cartel members in 2024. But most importantly, this should make clear that these motherfuckers talking secession, and where there is secession, there is civil war. And instead of just 13 states like we had during the Declaration of Secession in 1861 and the subsequent Civil War, this time we have 25 states backing Texas against the federal government. And they've already signed their joint statement. The 25 states eager to see this country's union crumble are who you'd expect them to be. but I'm gonna name them because I believe in naming and shaming. Alabama, Alaska, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Indiana, Iowa, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, Utah, Virginia, West Virginia, and Wyoming. And if you're still deluding yourself to believe that Greg Abbott and every other Republican governor responsible for a state who is backing him means anything other than business, please know that after the Supreme Court's ruling, the Lieutenant Governor Patrick not only told us they were going to continue to put up more wire, he said that he went to the border to, quote, thank them, support them, and also to stand with them, just in case the Biden administration sent Border Patrol. He said that wisely the Biden administration didn't send the Border Patrol there. He said that we're thankful they didn't because we don't want a confrontation, but we want this border secure. So in other words,
definitely concerns me a little bit, you know what I mean? But, I packed that thing too, so you come around this way, you will get caught.
Listen, even if you're a demon yourself or just someone who's bought into American propaganda that you should just do it the right way so you could care less about the migrants dying and being maimed at the border, you aren't in any less danger by what it means that Abbott is refusing to listen to both the federal government and the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is meant to serve as the final check in our system of checks and balances. If states simply disregard the Supreme Court, their authority will become meaningless, and so too do the constitutional rights they've recognized and are tasked with defending. And this isn't just political theory mumbo jumbo, it's very much a real thing. You probably remember this from high school, but the Supreme Court actually used to be very weak at the beginning of this nation's history. The Supreme Court was meant to be the, quote, least dangerous branch of the government because they had no soldiers or money to make people do what they wanted, according to Alexander Hamilton. In other words, you can make some rulings, sure, but if we don't want to do it, what you gonna do about it, pussy? So, SCOTUS was weak as until your boy John Marshall came around in 1803 and established judicial review in the very famous case I know you're remembering now, Marbury versus Madison. Judicial review isn't explicitly said in the Constitution, but Marshall believed it was obviously inferred that the Supreme Court had the right to decide whether something was unconstitutional. And that's really the beginning of the court beginning to get some respect around this bitch. And when that authority has been challenged, it's posed significant threat to marginalized people. For example, you remember Brown versus Board of Education? When the Supreme Court ruled that separate wasn't equal and thus the laws requiring Black and white people to attend segregated schools were unconstitutional, which, ironically enough, is one of the major cases where the South raised the compact theory argument in court to justify why they had the right to segregate schools and ignore the court. Well, the South, the Confederate States, weren't having that. They weren't having it so much that they literally organized what's known as the Massive Resistance, or the Stanley Plan. It was a plan used by Senator Harry Byrd. It had a lot of legs on it, on how the state would use their funds, and they would create discriminatory boards to prevent Black students from getting into schools. But that was the least of what the governors were willing to do. The Arkansas governor sent the National Guard to help the segregationists prevent Black children from entering the schools altogether. An incident that became known as the Little Rock Crisis, because President Eisenhower considered using the National Guard as the Little Rock Nine had to cross a mob and armed officers just to exercise their rights to enter and go to the school. Because the southern states had decided that they don't give a less what the Supreme Court had to say. The court would go on to have to reaffirm its ruling in a case called Brown versus Board 2, and then finally in a case called Cooper versus Aaron, where they had to not just reaffirm Brown and Brown 2, but to explicitly reject the compact theory and state that the states had no right to nullify or ignore their decisions in Brown and Brown 2. You know how they always tell us if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it? This is why. Because what's happening now has happened before, and we should understand the magnitude of what's to come and how people suffer when states decide to buck the systems of checks and balances to do the inhumane things that they want to do. But Greg Abbott is not just bad on immigration or the Constitution. He is also bad on everything else. There have been at least 7 mass shootings in Texas since Greg Abbott became governor in 2015. There was the Sutherland Spring Church shooting in 2017, where a 26-year-old white man named Devin Kelly walked into the Sutherland Springs Church and shot and killed 27 people and injured another 22 people. And do you know what the Texas Attorney General said? Quote, "We've had shootings in churches for, forever. It's gonna happen again. And so we need people in churches, professional security, or at least arming some of the parishioners or the congregation so they can respond when something like this happens again. End quote. And Greg Abbott topped that off with a good old thoughts and prayers.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
I'm not even gonna act surprised that in 2017, their response to the church getting shot up was, well, you know, our churches stay getting shot up and they will stay getting shot up. So get your pastors blickied up and get the out of our face instead of doing something to stop every Tom, Dick, and crazy from being able to get a gun. Because after the Sutherland Spring Church shooting, there was the Santa Fe High School shooting in 2018, where a 17-year-old white boy went to school with a shotgun and a revolver and shot and killed 10 people. What did Greg Abbott do then? Moment of silence in school shooter drills, but still, no gun restrictions. Then there was the El Paso Walmart shooting August 3rd, 2019, where a 21-year-old white boy, specifically targeting Mexicans, this motherfucker drove all the way from Allen to El Paso, walked into a Walmart and killed 22 people. And literally just a few weeks later, the Midland-Odessa rampage the same month, where a 36-year-old white man went on a whole drive-by shooting spree where he used an AR-15 to shoot 8 people to death. And what did Greg Abbott do after having 2 mass shootings in the space of a month on his watch? He signed 8 executive orders doing everything but restricting gun access. In fact, this mother really did his big one, because he not only failed to pass any new gun regulations, they actually passed a law making it significantly easier to buy and carry guns, eliminating permit requirements for handguns altogether in most cases so that people were allowed to carry handguns with no license at all. So yeah, despite these mass shootings, your boy Greg insists on making it easier to get guns. Not coincidentally, as much as Greg and his Republican boys love running their mouth about liberal Democrat cities and their gun violence, please let it be known that the prize for Abbott's continued weakening of the gun laws in Texas is that Texas not only has the highest rates of gun deaths in the country, gun deaths are the leading cause of deaths for Texans under 18 years old. On average, 3,996 people die and 5,556 are wounded by guns every year in Texas. And that's how we got Uvalde.
I want to just tell you exactly what's going on. The nation is ending a week marked by the second worst school shooting ever. But we continue to get these new details out of Texas which show mistakes, misinformation, and in some places, lies. It shows that the ongoing tragedy has become clearly a full-blown scandal, especially for Texas's Republican Governor Greg Abbott, who now says he's, quote, livid about how he received what was false information about aspects of this attack and response, and then how he spread it. But he's also using this as a time to take his platform within a crisis to lie about gun safety and gun control. Now, here are the new details that are emerging about the failed police response to this shooter, and some of them are just absolutely gut-wrenching. We are learning the timeline, which has now been updated because of the misinformation I mentioned. We're learning that 19 police officers erroneously waited 45 minutes outside the classroom without ever breaking in to confront the killer inside. We are learning that the killer was able to thus continue to repeatedly fire weapons again while the police were outside the door. We are learning that more calls to 911 kept pouring in from inside the classroom from the children inside who'd watched their fellow students murdered. And those new calls were begging for police who we now know were just a few feet away. And we know those police continued to wait and fail to act. Experts say this is a total breakdown failure and that it was a, quote, wrong decision. Days later, Texas officials do not even have words to try to explain this response failure.
Personally, I knew that Greg Abbott couldn't be stopped when Uvalde didn't end him. I wrote an article for Teen Vogue titled Uvalde Shooting, a case for defunding the police and disarming teens. In that article, I said that there had never been a clearer demonstration of police ineptitude, dishonesty, failure, and callous disregard for our lives than what unfolded in Uvalde, Texas, the shooting at Robb Elementary School. Despite the fact that Uvalde invests nearly 40% of their annual budget in the police department, they had a local SWAT team, and the school district itself had its own police department. On May 24th, 2022, at least 19 officers allowed the shooter to barricade himself in a classroom, then stood out in the hallway for at least 40 minutes while students hiding in adjoining classrooms called 911 repeatedly, at least 6 times begging them to please send help. And not only did those police stand outside and allow a 4th grade class to be massacred while they stood outside, sometimes with their backs to the school, they actually tackled, tased, handcuffed, and threatened to arrest the parents of the children who were begging them to either go inside or let them go inside and save their children. And the police were caught in more lies than we can count. The police lied so goddamn much, and Greg Abbott fed those lies to the media and the public so goddamn much that he had no choice but to admit it.
Yes, I was misled. I am livid about what happened. I was on this very stage 2 days ago, and I was telling the public information that had been told to me in a room just a few yards behind where we're located right now. I wrote down hand notes in detail about what everybody in that room told me in sequential order about what happened. And when I came out here on this stage and told the public what happened, it was a recitation of what people in that room told me, whether it be law enforcement officials or non-law enforcement officials, whatever the case may be. And as everybody has learned, the information that I was given turned out in part to be inaccurate.
Uvalde happened because an 18-year-old white boy was able to waltz into a store and just buy 2 AR-15s, which, by the way, has been the weapon of choice in at least 13 high-profile mass shootings since 2012. And let's stop right quick and look at the identities of all the mass shooters who've been terrorizing Texas. And let's have a moment of silence for what they all have in common. Interesting how Greg Abbott isn't asking to use the powers he has, let alone expand them, to stop these white boys from shooting up Texas every chance they get. But he don't get tired of telling you what a danger to Texas the Mexicans are. Okay. When it comes to these white Yosemite Sam ass bitches terrorizing every public place in Texas, suddenly he don't stereotype groups. Suddenly it's about these individuals struggling with mental health, which is interesting because it would suggest that this man who is unwilling to restrict access to guns because he says the problem is mental health, not guns, would certainly be trying to pour money into mental health and healthcare, right? Nado. Texas ranks dead last in mental health care in the United States and 41st for prevalence of youth mental illness and lack of access to care. And that still didn't stop your man Greg from slashing $211 million from the department that oversees the state's mental health services just a month before the Uvalde shooting in 2022. Worse than that, Texas openly calls its prison system the largest provider of mental health care in the state. Think about that for a second.
So everybody in the state of Texas now agrees, including Sheriff's Association, the Texas Association of Counties, the Jail Commission, everybody is comfortable saying, well, the county jail system is the largest provider, quote unquote, provider of mental health care in the state of Texas. And I refuse to accept that definition. What we say is that the county jail system in Texas is the largest warehouse of people with mental illness in the state of Texas. And Harris County Jail, Harris County where I live, is the largest one in the state of Texas. Over 80% of our population is tagged as psych. So,
wow.
Like, how did we get here, right? I mean, that's the question that I want answered, is how did we get here? Because we saw this happening in the last 8-10 years. Slowly we saw this happening. Because every session we hear about millions and millions of dollars going into mental health care, quote unquote, working with justice-involved populations. But somehow we still end up seeing people who are the state's clients in the jails. And I'll give you an anecdote which is so common in our work that we see like almost every day. A family calls the crisis outreach line, which is a mandatory service that the state has to provide. It's called the Mobile Crisis Outreach Team. So it's called the MCOT. So you call this line, crisis hotline, because your loved one is in crisis. They respond and they go, well, is he or she actively hurting himself or somebody else? If not, then we can't engage. Okay. If the response is yes, they're actively hurting themselves or somebody else, well, now it's too late. You have to call the cops, or we're going to send the cops. So when is it like not bad enough in between,
right,
like not bad enough and bad enough? When is the right time for the crisis team to engage? Seems like never, because it's either this, like you're waiting for somebody to do something where at that point now they're at a very high risk of incarceration. But then on the other hand, when it gets to that point, the solution is cops, and then they go straight to jail. So I often say in my interviews, when we talk about the mental health crisis in jails, I say the road to our public mental health system is being forced to go through the jails.
Mental health care is so abhorrent in Texas, especially with respect to how people struggling with mental health are criminalized, that even the officers and the people working within the system find themselves agreeing with the advocates on at least that much.
We had a case, not one, actually several cases this past year, where people called the crisis line. Their families called because they were self-harming, they were trying to commit suicide. They were taken to the hospital. They continued to try committing suicide in the hospital. The hospital got mad because the beam broke when they were trying to hang themselves. They called the sheriff's office, and without stabilizing this person, they shipped them off to the jail. Now, I can't understand why the sheriff had to book that person in their jail, because sure enough, within a week, that person killed themselves in suicide watch. So why? This person voluntarily admitted themselves to the hospital, even though they were in crisis. They understood enough to know that they needed to be admitted. So they signed, and then they admitted to the hospital. And the hospital shipped them off to the jail without stabilizing them. Yes. And so we see that a lot. Criminalization of people with behavioral health issues at the place where they went to get care. And you see that in all those hospitals. There's huge posters that say, this type of behavior will not be tolerated. And there's like a whole list of things that will not be tolerated. But it's a behavioral health hospital. Language or shouting or erratic behavior. But this is what they're coming to the hospital for help for, right? Because they have the symptoms of their behavioral health are such that they are going to exhibit those kind of behaviors. But you're saying you are going to criminalize them for those behaviors. So we're seeing a lot of that happen, and those people end up sitting in jails. And of course, when they get to jail, they also keep racking up more charges in the jail because they can't follow direction. They just don't know how to be. We have so many horrendous cases where people with developmental disabilities, like, their brains haven't developed beyond 4 years because of either trauma or seizure disorders when they were kids or whatever, right? So now they look like grown-ups and adults, but they are kids in their mind. And jail uses restraints, like 4-point restraints on them, chemical restraints, obviously use of force because they don't know how to follow direction. And then you see them racking up charges. And so we have had to intervene sort of pretty dramatically in some cases, copy everybody at the legislature and the Judicial Commission on Mental Health and the Health and Human Services, like everybody and their grandmother, we copy them on these emails and say, do you realize this is the kind of person that you've got in your jail? And instead of diverting them, we tried to put some continuity of care in place after Sandra Bland passed away. It's called the Sandra Bland Act. Did lots of things. One of the things it did, it would have never saved Sandra Bland's life, but that's a different story. But according to Sandra Bland Act, you have to, at intake, you have to run a mental health screening on every person that's getting booked in. And you have to run their name through the state system to see if they were receiving services from the state for mental health or developmental disabilities in the past 3 years from the date of booking. And if their name flags up, then your local mental health authority in that county will automatically know. They'll get that notification. So we did that. After that, what happens, we are not very clear what happens because there is no meaningful continuity of care unless that local mental health authority has a contract with the jail to provide supplemental services. Otherwise, they don't have to do that unless they have a contract, which is bizarre. Like, I was talking to a sheriff in East Texas and he said, Krish, I don't understand. Why do I need a contract with my own mental health authority for them to serve their client who's inside my jail walls? What changes between outside my jail walls and inside my jail walls? They should still be coming and providing services. And he's absolutely right. But that's the way it's set up, right? So now this person is decompensating and there's no meaningful continuity of care. Then you're going to evaluate them and find them incompetent to stand trial. And then they're going to go wait for the state hospital bed for competency restoration, which is about 2 years long now. Our forensic wait list for people who are found incompetent to stand trial is over 2,200 right now. That's a 2-3 year long wait for a lot of people. Now, people think, oh, they're waiting for a bed for state hospital. Once they get there, they're going to get mental health care. No, we all know competency restoration is educating you about your rights and your charges just so we can punish you for your disability, right? So we have cases now of people waiting to go to the state hospital for competency restoration and dying while they're on the wait list, or waiting so long that they've timed out on their charges, so then they get kicked out, but again, not connected to services.
And remember Operation Lone Star from earlier? Well, in 2023, Greg Abbott cut millions of dollars from mental health care to fund it. But not to worry. He replaced the money he cut from mental health care by taking it from the money given to help Texas recover from the COVID pandemic. And speaking of COVID, Greg Abbott had one of the worst COVID responses in the nation, which is why his approval ratings with Texas voters dropped at the time. If you didn't know, it's because he was distracting you with Operation Lone Star madness on the border. Over 57,000 people have died from COVID in Texas since the pandemic began. People are still dying daily from COVID in Texas. At the height of COVID, Texas was getting as many as 17,000 new cases a day. The hospitals were so overcrowded and their staffs were so overworked and so overwhelmed that Greg Abbott had to ask the federal government for help and ask the hospitals to stop performing all elective procedures because at least 53 hospitals had completely run out of hospital beds. This is in no small part due to the fact that Greg Abbott banned mask mandates, he wouldn't require schools to conduct contact tracing, or that the schools inform parents if a student got COVID, and he allowed parents to send their sick-ass children to school. But back to Uvalde. What did Greg Abbott do for the people of Uvalde? Nothing. Thoughts and prayers. Now here's the real gag. Not only was Uvalde not the reckoning it should have been, Abbott got reelected just 5 months later and he won 60% of the vote in Uvalde. Ain't that some shit? The families of the children who were killed in Uvalde shooting supported Beto O'Rourke in the election because he was actually trying to do something about the easy access to guns by raising the minimum age required to buy AR-15s. And yet, the people of Uvalde did not, to which some of the family members commented. Business Insider and the Texas Tribune reported that Jasmine Cazares, the 17-year-old sister of a 9-year-old girl, Jacqueline Cazares, who was killed in the shooting, said, quote, "Unfortunately, 21 people dead doesn't change people's minds." Belinda Areola, the grandmother of a 10-year-old girl who was killed, Amarie Jo Garza, said, quote, "The only thing that is going to change people's minds is when it happens to them." And a teacher, Veronica Mata, commented, quote, "Everybody has the right to vote for whoever they want. We just hoped that they would see where we were coming from and see what we wanted to change."
You have to be 21 to buy a case of beer, but an 18-year-old bought a gun to kill kids. That does not make sense.
To be clear, that's a call to raise the age limit to buy an AR-15 style weapon from 18 to 21. A Republican governor in Florida broke with the NRA to sign this into law after the Parkland mass shooting. Governor Abbott, you say this can't be done in Texas. Mr. O'Rourke, you say it will be done if you're elected. Can you please explain your positions? Let's start with you, Governor Abbott. You have 60 seconds.
First, there's no reason why a little girl like that should ever have to say anything like that. There's a reason why these parents are angry, and they're rightfully angry, and I can feel their pain. No parent should lose a child, and we want to do everything we can to make sure that does not happen. We want to end school shootings, but we cannot do that by making false promises. It's a false promise to suggest that we can pass a law that will be upheld by the Constitution to raise the age, and here's why. The most recent Federal Court of Appeals decision on this particular issue said that it was unconstitutional for a state to raise the age from 18 to 21 for a person to buy an AR-15. So any attempt to try to raise the age is going to be met with it being overturned. So we need to get to the bottom of what is really ailing our communities, and that is the mental health that is leading people to engage in school shootings, and Texas is already addressing that.
Now let's break down all the lies, shall we?
The lies! There you go, this bitch.
The lies. First, he says there's no reason why a little girl should have to say anything like that. But he's the reason, no? There have been 7 school shootings on his watch, and many of which, like the ones this little girl is talking about, were carried out by 18-year-olds Abbott insists should be allowed to buy dangerous weapons like AR-15s. He says the parents are rightfully angry and he can feel their pain, but he clearly doesn't feel it enough to do anything about it. He's saying no parent should lose a child and he wants to do everything in his power to make sure that doesn't happen, but clearly not. This isn't some kind of mystery. The parents and the children that he says his heart goes out to so deeply are explicitly telling him what they want and need to be done. Raise the age limit. Stop letting people be able to buy guns like Tic Tacs. And he has continuously said no. More than no. Remember, this is the man who actually made it easier to get guns after the El Paso and Midland Odessa shootings, which brings us to the second point. He says he can't raise the age limit because that wouldn't be constitutional. First of all, it's not unconstitutional at all. In fact, I want y'all to know the Supreme Court has had very little to say on the issue of gun rights throughout American history in general. It's actually a pretty sparse doctrinal thread, but nowhere in the Constitution, nor in any precedent established by the court, is anyone guaranteed the right to a gun at 18 years old. The state has the ability to decide age restrictions and other restrictions, which Greg Abbott obviously knows because Texas regulates guns how they like, mostly not requiring permits and the like when they please. But even if the Constitution explicitly said you have a constitutional right to an AR-15 when you turn 18 years old, this entire video is about the fact that Greg Abbott could not begin to give the slightest about what the Constitution, the federal government, or the Supreme Court says if it doesn't align with what he wants to do, period. Because you know what is explicit in the Constitution and or well-established precedent from the Supreme Court? Checks and balances. That where there's conflict between the federal and the state government, the federal government wins. That immigration and the border is a federal issue, and that it's the literal constitutional obligation of the Supreme Court to be the final decision makers on whether something is constitutional. And they told him the shit he's doing at the border is unconstitutional. And you know what that said? Tell Joe Biden and the federal government to concede me. I'll be waiting at the border. This is the same motherfucker telling anybody who he suspects is Mexican they better have their freedom papers, despite the fact that the Supreme Court already told Arizona to cut that shit out. He don't care about nobody's constitution. Third, he says the real issue is mental health, but we've been over this already. The man doesn't give a about mental health or providing resources to deal with it. And while we're at it, despite all that law and order, public safety, tough on crime, indict shit, he be talking when he wants to convince us that all migrants are senior members of the cartel. When it comes to guns and the real mass shootings actually happening in Texas, he won't so much as support red flag laws.
Governor Abbott, the last time you ran for governor, we asked you about red flag laws, and those are laws which could stop an individual with potential intention to harm others from purchasing a gun. And you said about that, quote, "I would not support a red flag law that would take guns away from people without due process." Now, a lot has happened in those 4 years. Are you open to implementing red flag laws today? You have 30 seconds.
Well, let me tell you what I support and I don't support. What I support is making it a felony for someone to lie on a background check. I signed that into law last year. I approve of expanding background checks to include juvenile records. Also approve of making it a crime for criminal gangs to buy or to possess a gun. But I'm still against red flag laws for the reason that it would deny a lawful Texas gun owner their constitutional right to due process.
And let me just break that dog whistle down in case it got by you. So he says he's made it illegal for gang members to buy or own guns altogether, but he can't support raising the age to own guns beyond 18 years old, or to take the guns away from people who've been flagged as a threat to either themselves or others, because that would violate their rights to due process. So let's review our notes, shall we? You already know that he's arresting any Latino, mostly American citizens, and accusing them of being migrants who cross the border illegally. So you know how he perceives different groups of people. Which groups of people do you think he and his police officers are assuming are gang members? Who are these people that he feels comfortable taking their guns from, the right to guns altogether? It's somehow totally constitutional and not violating anyone's rights to their guns to completely deny these people the right to buy or own a gun at all. But there's something stopping him from doing the much more minor regulation of simply raising the age or invoking red flag laws. Why is that? Well, this discussion we're having about raising the age and red flag laws is specifically about stopping the mass shootings in Texas. Now let's again flash on the screen a photo of the perpetrators of the mass shootings and observe what they have in common. So that's whose rights they're talking about when raise the age and red flag laws comes up, because that's who we're trying to stop from carrying out these mass shootings. And then, and only then, does the same Greg Abbott requiring freedom papers from the Latinos, arresting American citizens under suspicion of being immigrants, and profiling black and brown people as gang members so we can strip them of their gun rights altogether, ignoring and threatening the federal government on the border, suddenly become gridlocked by the Constitution. Okay, sure, buddy. If Greg Abbott wanted to do something about guns, if he gave a about you or your children, he would, but he doesn't. He cares about the NRA. Period. Don't let this man play in your face like he's some champion of the Constitution. And it's not just migrants and school children Greg's letting down. Oh no, he's got smoke for women, black people, and the entire LGBTQ community too. But you knew that already. Listen, in Texas, it is an all-out assault on marginalized groups. So let's take a top-down approach, starting with the things that impacts everyone under the umbrella and moving down to his specific attacks on individual groups. So I think the best place to start is with education, because that to me is an under-recognized but critical tool in the right's assault on freedoms and the response to the Black Lives Matter movement and the more progressive shift the society is moving towards. Speaking of Black Lives Matter, a movement that Greg Abbott is no fan of, might I add. He's actually working on pardoning a man who killed a protester at a Black Lives Matter rally in 2020 as we speak. The man's name was Daniel Perry, not to be confused with Daniel Penny, who murdered a young black homeless man in New York City, Jordan Neely, on the subway. But I do think it's worth mentioning that both of these white men carrying out these hate crimes have military backgrounds. Daniel Perry being an Army sergeant and Daniel Penny being an ex-Marine. Take that information and do with it what you may. It's not a coincidence to me that the rise of Black Lives Matter, particularly during the summer of 2020, following George Floyd's murder, when there were protests happening every day, everywhere across the country, making Black Lives Matter arguably the most popular civil rights movement of all time, that the right started to make a concerted effort to ban books, ban Black history, attack education in schools and colleges, attacking TikTok, Twitter, and anything that they perceived as responsible for the seismic shift and how the public viewed the bigotry and abuse that are still the status quo, but no longer go unchallenged. Because the reality is, when people know better, they do better. And that's why Republicans don't want people being taught American history. Notice, I didn't say Black history. I said American history, because that's what Black history is. I want people to start questioning why American history wouldn't include all of America's history, everything that's happened in America and everything America's done. Why would history be cherry-picked information that excludes quite literally everyone that's not white in this country? Why would the history of Black people in this country be removed from that narrative? The same goes for Native American history, LGBTQ history, and every other important part of the story that's deliberately left out so that Americans can continue seeing whiteness as default and everyone else and everything pertaining to them as other, optional, and electives. And none of these attacks are new, just elevated. Republicans have always been attacking education because here's the unpleasant reality that the right doesn't like to hear. The more educated you are, the least likely you are to identify with and vote Republican. It just is what it is. When I was in college back in 2011, and before for others, Republicans were constantly attacking liberal arts colleges and social sciences as the breeding ground for indoctrinating their children, which is why conservatives hated Twitter so much, where the users were more likely to be younger, college educated, and more likely to vote Democrat. And that's precisely why right-wing bandits like Elon Musk took it over and immediately started banning major leftist accounts, stripping articles of their headlines to make it harder to disseminate news, which has been the primary use of the site. And now they've transferred that hate to TikTok, which has effectively kind of taken on the role Twitter once filled, allowing young progressives to give voice to issues and news the right prefers to be buried. And again, when did they start calling for banning TikTok? After the 2020 protests. It's why Nikki Haley's nut ass was just calling for a TikTok ban the other day. The right has an old playbook and they don't switch tactics. It's the same rebranded tactic every time and it's a simple one. Keep people from learning, period. First, it was affirmative action. Then it was liberal arts colleges. Then it was critical race theory. Then it was wokeness. Then it was the woke man virus. Then it was cancel culture. Then it was the culture wars. Then it was books. Then it was TikTok. Now it's DEI. They are invested in keeping people uninformed, and that's why their base is stupid as and they know what they're doing. Remember when Fox got sued because Tucker Carlson was defaming Karen McDougal and Fox argued, quote, no reasonable viewer takes Tucker Carlson seriously? They know they feed people stupid, absolute lies, and the court knows it too because they agreed and ruled in their favor. Because what I'm always trying to explain to people is that right-wing views or the status quo are not so pervasive and prevalent because they are rock-solid, intelligent theories that are hard to debunk. In fact, the opposite is true. They're simply what you hear the most and are constantly being taught and reinforced to believe. If you could hear the counter argument or the real facts, their house of bigoted bricks comes tumbling down. The right's only tactic consists entirely of preventing people from having access to information contrary to what they're feeding us. That's why, while the left is busy toiling and racking our brains as to how to get specific messages to the public, Republicans are never trying to figure out how to tell us anything. They're only ever working to keep the other side from telling people things at all. So it should come as no surprise that Greg Abbott banned at least 625 books from Texas schools. He told the public he banned sexually explicit books, but big surprise, that's a lie. Most of the books banned have committed no crime other than centering the experience of marginalized communities like Black people, POC, LGBT people, Jewish people, Muslim people. He banned books like Nobel Prize winner Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, that told the story of a little Black girl struggling to deal with the effects of racism and abuse during the Great Depression era. He banned George Johnson's All Boys Aren't Blue, which tells the author's own life story of growing up Black and queer. He even banned The Black Friend, a book by my friend and author Frederick Joseph. But that's not all. He's also rolling around and saying things like go woke, go broke, and signed a law banning diversity, equity, and inclusion offices from every Texas college, or else he'd strip them of their state funding. He's called them anti-whites and claimed Texas will now return to promoting merit, because the implication there is that Black people and other people of color are not qualified and undeserving. Abbott, like the whole Republican Party, will not get off Black people in the LGBT community's neck. And I mean it deeply when I say he is on the LGBTQ community's neck. In 2015, he was fighting the legalization of gay marriage. In 2017, he signed a law allowing adoption agencies to discriminate against LGBT people and called a special session to try to pass a law regulating what public bathrooms trans people could use. In 2019, he jumped down Chick-fil-A's throat for finally deciding to stop funding their anti-LGBT hate groups. In 2021, he signed a law banning trans athletes from school sports.
And in Texas last session, we passed a law prohibiting biological men from competing in women's sports in the education level from high school down. This next session, we will pass a law prohibiting biological men to compete against women in college sports.
In 2022, this man started real-life investigating trans kids' families for providing their children with gender-affirming care. But books aren't all he's banning. Let's talk abortion. Because Greg Abbott banned that before the Supreme Court even got around to overturning Roe. In 2021, Greg Abbott passed a 6-week abortion ban, which prior to Roe being overturned was one of the strictest abortion laws in the country. He not only banned abortions at 6 weeks, he gave private citizens the ability to sue abortion providers, and there was no exception for rape or incest. So if that's how he was carrying on before Roe, you just know he couldn't wait to ban abortion altogether once Roe was overturned, and that's exactly what the he did. No exceptions for rape. He even went as far as to tell survivors of rape to take Plan B, and that he'll just eliminate rape. Oh, why didn't we think of that? Just get rid of rape.
This morning, growing outrage over Governor Greg Abbott's stunning response to a question about why Texas's new abortion law lacks an exception for rape or incest. The Republican governor's answer? His state will eliminate the crime of rape altogether.
Texas will work tirelessly to make sure that we eliminate all rapists from the streets of Texas by aggressively going out and arresting them and prosecuting them and getting them off the streets. So goal number one in the state of Texas is to eliminate rape so that no woman, no person will be a victim of rape.
The reality, Abbott has not required the legislature to take up any rape prevention legislation.
So no exceptions for rape, no exceptions for incest, and he truly doesn't give a about medical emergencies either, life-threatening or not, because this happened literally as I was writing this. On February 23rd, Texas doctors refused to give a woman a medically necessary abortion for an ectopic pregnancy. The Biden administration passed a federal law following Roe called the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, requiring the states to perform life-saving abortions. And you know what Texas said? You and go to hell, we not doing it. And he doesn't plan to stop at abortion.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott is weighing in on Alabama's landmark Supreme Court decision that frozen embryos are human beings. The court also ruled people who get rid of embryos can be held liable for wrongful death. Some Alabama fertility clinics have now stopped offering IVF services. This morning on CNN's State of the Union, Governor Abbott said Texas will be among many states who will consider the next steps with IVF.
What I don't know is families who may have frozen embryos, what happens if they were done so that a mother could have a pregnancy, but after those embryos were frozen, the mother passes away? What happens then?
We have to understand the real issue, and it's not abortion. It's Republicans wanting to dismantle women's rights and women's ability to choose. That's what the Republicans are trying to sell to white Americans, particularly white men, that they can go back to the days where they could get a wife they could control, leave her barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, treat her however, and she could not leave. That's why you see them suddenly going after no-fault divorce and now IVF. And don't even for 1 second think that any of this is because Greg Abbott or Texas gives a about children, babies, pregnancy, women, pregnant people, or any of it. Please get strapped into your seat because it's about to get harrowing.
We support the defense work for Operation Lone Star detainees, and because of that, we hear a lot about the conditions in those two facilities, and we can see, how absolutely insane it is. Like now they're arresting women, arresting pregnant women. Yeah, so it's just I wake up every morning cursing Governor Abbott. That's all I can say. The thing that really triggered me and my other friends to start Texas Jail Project was this one story that my friend told us. This person that she was locked up with, Black woman, young, high-risk pregnancy. She was locked up there for a bounce check. Obviously couldn't afford an attorney, couldn't afford her bail. She had never made it in her pregnancy beyond 7 months. She had health issues. She was always high risk. That particular pregnancy, she made it beyond 7 months and then started having problems. And when she started asking for help, this was Victoria County Jail, about 3 hours from Harris County on the Gulf Coast. She started asking for help and they stuck her in solitary, where she kept pressing the red button for help. And of course, help never came. And she ended up having the baby on top of the toilet and the baby died. And then she was never even allowed to go attend the baby's funeral, like whatever. It was a horrific story. But we said, let's just collect these stories and we'll give them to the people who are experts and we'll go back to our lives. And so we set up this little website. We shared a few stories. And because all we knew at that time were women and pregnant women's issues, stuff just started pouring in. It was like floodgates open. People started sharing their stories. So we were like, oh, this is a bigger problem than we thought. This is not like a one-off thing. This one woman being stuck in solitary and giving birth, and like this is not one-off. Okay, so now we have all these stories. We said, okay, let's just go to the commissioner's court or go to the jail commission and share these stories. So we went to the jail commission and the pushback was, all these sheriffs going, y'all must be making this shit up because we don't have that many pregnant women in our jails. So we said, that's a great question. Like, how many do we have? Because we can't seem to find any data on them. And they said, oh, well, we don't count them. So there was no data being collected on. Right? So so pregnant women literally did not count. So that was our first legislative win in 2008, 2009, when we said, you have to count. As soon as you find out that they're pregnant, or if you test them and they find out they're pregnant, you have to count and have a monthly report. So now we know that roughly 400 to 500 pregnant people are booked every month in Texas County jails.
And there's a specific way that the abortion ban is overlapping with the criminal system. And I wouldn't be me if I didn't tell y'all what Greg Abbott is doing with Texas jails and incarcerated people. You knew it was coming. Let's talk jails. Y'all know that Rikers, bail reform, and pretrial jail conditions here in New York City are my bread and butter. So there was no way I was going to let you leave this video without understanding what Greg Abbott is doing to the jails and the people awaiting trial in his state. So I went to Krish Gundu, founder of the Texas Jail Project, because that's her wheelhouse and she delivered. By the time Krish and I were done talking, I was so overwhelmed with the magnitude of the problem in Texas. So I'm going to share some of that conversation with you here. If you're interested in watching the entire interview with Krish, let me know and maybe I'll make that available for the people who have paid memberships to my channel. So comment and click that button. For now, take it away, Krish.
Last year we had in the entire state, just in county jails, right? So our county jail population is about 76,000 roughly. Over 76% is pretrial. In Harris County, that number was about 87% pretrial. In Harris County, we had 28 reported custody deaths in 2022. In 2023, we had 19 reported, but we know there were 21.
Yeah.
They ship people to the hospital and give them a PR bond, and then they don't have to count the deaths, right? We know how they hide those deaths. So we know there were more than than they reported. So we always talk about the number that was reported, which is often much less than the number that's actually true. And in the entire state last year, we still keep finding deaths that are not reported. So we send notifications to the sheriff's office and say, hey, do you know it's a Class B misdemeanor not to report the death to the AG's office within 30 days? And so this past year, in 13 months, since January 2023 to January 2024, we got 13 deaths reported statewide that were previously unreported. Wow. So as per our numbers last year, we've had about 191 deaths, city deaths in our jails, in the entire state of Texas. That's 242 county jails. So let me backtrack. So 2 sessions ago, we had a passage of a bill called SB 6. And SB 6 was sold to us as a quote-unquote bail reform bill. But what it really was it was punishment to Harris County, which is where I live, the largest county jail in the state. We have about 10,000 people. And it was punishment to Harris County for us having passed misdemeanor bail reform, which was successful. It's keeping thousands of people out of jails because we give them general order bonds now when they are charged with misdemeanors. But it was a huge hit for the bail bond industry, right? Like they lost millions and billions of dollars overnight. And so SB 6 was a move to prevent this good sort of misdemeanor bail reform from spreading to the other counties in Texas, because there were other lawsuits in Dallas and Travis County, Austin, and other places where they were trying to do the same thing. And so this was a way to stop that from happening and spreading to the rest of Texas. So what SB 6 essentially did was that because our misdemeanor bail reform was a federal consent decree, it couldn't really touch it. They tried to break it down, but it couldn't really touch it. It was protected, but then nobody else could have it in the rest of the state. So because of SB 6, we've had massive pretrial detention expansion. Jails are overcrowded to the point where our jail, Harris County Jail, we are sending almost 1,200 people out of the county at a cost of $50.3 million to the taxpayers. And this is the part that really kills me. $50.3 million to private prison companies. And not just in-state, out of the state. So we have 4 places we're sending our folks to. West Texas, about 7 hours away, a facility run by MTC, which is a private prison company. Then we're sending folks to Louisiana with LaSalle Corrections. And then we're sending folks to Mississippi with Core Civic. So we have 4 different facilities in which we are spending $50.3 million per year to send about 1,200 people pre-trial, all of them pre-trial, right? And when people die there, which has happened, when a person died in Louisiana, the state of Texas doesn't have to do anything. We don't have to count their death. We don't have to investigate there. We don't have to do anything, which is great way to make people disappear pre-trial.
Right. It's to make it right, because they're putting the deaths off on other people. They don't count. They're not the Texas in custody deaths, even though.
Right. So it was our community member. We paid for their incarceration. We paid for their transportation to LaSalle in Louisiana. But once they were dead, they didn't count. They literally don't count anymore. But I digress. So that's the ripple effect of SB 6 is the expansion in pretrial detention. So if 3 years ago somebody had said to me, you're going to have a jail that's overcrowded and exploding once again, I would have laughed them off, because we had just passed misdemeanor bail reform and we were going to keep thousands of people out of jail. But I guess one of the unintended consequences of that has been they are so pissed off that they decided, we're going to overcharge people. I guess we're going to charge them with felonies because then you can't get out. But also a provision in SB 6 was, even if you're charged with a misdemeanor now, that doesn't matter. If you had a felony like 20 years ago, you've gone to prison, you've taken care of that, it's all clear and done. That's what we're going to talk about. That's what we're going to take into account and not give you a PR bond now for your misdemeanor.
Wow.
So that's the reason why now, not in Harris County, but in all the other counties, the explosion in jail population has been a lot of people who are sitting there on misdemeanors who can't get a PR bond because of ancient history. One of the other things that was part of SB 6, they punished all the bail funds. So community bail funds, we had a community bail fund in East Texas. We shut it down after SB 6 passed because one of the provisions in SB 6 was, well, first of all, you have to report every month to the sheriff about all your bailouts. And secondly, you can't bail people out who have felonies. So we said, well, are the bail bond companies going to follow the same rules? Right. Are you going to have them report on all their bailouts every month? No? Well, then why are we being held to a different standard, right? And so we just shut down our community bail fund, unfortunately, because we didn't want to go through those extra reporting requirements, and we didn't want to be told who we could bail out and not bail out. Like, why can't we bail out people on felonies, right? That whole line drawing between misdemeanors and felonies and non-violent and violent, we just didn't want to follow it.
It just goes to show how the system, it has nothing to do with, they don't want to honor any pretrial system or anything that they say. Is all just smoke and mirrors, because the minute you set this high bail on people, you set high bail on poor people that you know they can't pay, so that they have to go to jail pretrial on something they haven't been convicted of, so that they don't actually have their rights. And then if other people want to bail them out, which is their right, they go and get the money to bail them out.
Yeah.
You have decided that they can't be bailed out. So effectively, what you are making sure you do is that you're punishing people pre-trial. You're making sure that people go to jail for crimes they've not been convicted of. So that brings us to the end. Not the end of all Greg Abbott's wrongdoings, but the end of this video, because y'all, I am tired. I am tired. Would y'all believe that my dumbass decided to do this video thinking, oh, this is gonna be way less work than Eric Adams? I thought it would be, Greg Abbott is not my personal arch enemy the way that Eric Adams is, so it'll be easy. And what a naive and silly thought. Because imagine thinking you're gonna compile all the wrongdoings of a nigga who been governor 3 times, attorney general, and sat on the Supreme Court. The clown is me, okay? I was quickly exhausted. But if you did make it to the end, I hope that you enjoyed this video. I didn't really get to touch on a lot of things in depth, like how he handles crime, homelessness, policing, the climate crisis. And honestly, there's a lot more to discuss in terms of him and voting, the Black community and the LGBT community. But this was already long. Okay, this was long. I could have wrapped this up at immigration and him on the border, and this would have still been long. So if you enjoyed this and you really want me to do a part 2 of touching on everything I left out, comment and let your girl know. And otherwise, in general, please share, subscribe, like, comment it. If you haven't noticed, I finally have a members part of my channel. Y'all can join. Pay your girl a little something and get extra exclusive content. I have a lot of things coming for y'all. I know that I had taken I had a little bit of a hiatus, because if you have been following me, I let y'all know that I've been sick. I have an autoimmune disorder and it's been whooping my ass. So thank y'all for giving me so much grace to get this to you. I have so much for y'all. Please subscribe. It's going to be a content-filled year. Thank you.